The frostbite usually takes your fingers first, then your mind. When your own family locks you out of the cabin in late October, deep in the Alaskan bush, it's not an eviction, it's an execution. But the wilderness doesn't care about human betrayal. And as they soon learned, neither did she. The wind howling through the Iron Creek Valley didn't just carry the promise of winter, it carried a death sentence. Cora Higgins stood in the dirt road, clutching a canvas duffel bag containing a spare wool sweater, a flint striker, a hunting knife, and a single tarp. Behind her, the heavy oak door of the homestead she had built with her own 2 hands slammed shut. The deadbolt slid into place with a definitive metallic click. Inside that warm, insulated log cabin were her sister, Beatrice, and her brother-in-law, Arthur Pendleton. The betrayal had been months in the making, woven with legal loopholes, forged signatures, and a quiet, malicious greed. Iron Creek was a remote, off-grid community of 20-odd people in the unforgiving heart of Alaska. The law out here was whatever Sheriff Thomas Miller said it was, and Arthur had spent the last year buying Thomas's loyalty with top-shelf whiskey and shared hunting leases. When their father died, the deed to the 500-acre homestead was supposed to go to Cora. Instead, Arthur produced a revised will. Within a week, the man who had never swung an axe in his life declared himself the master of the property. They didn't just kick Cora out. They waited until the final supply plane left for the season. It was October 28th. The ground was already hardening. The first major snowfall was days away. In Iron Creek, if you didn't have 4 walls, a wood stove, and a cord of seasoned birch by Halloween, you were a ghost in waiting. Go down to the lower valley, Cora. Arthur had sneered from the porch earlier that morning, his breath pluming in the freezing air. Squat on the public land. Maybe you'll figure out how to be useful before the wolves get you. Beatrice hadn't even looked her in the eye. Cora didn't weep. The shock of the betrayal burned hot in her chest, a raging furnace of adrenaline and absolute clarity. She had 72 hours before the first blizzard of the season hit. If she panicked, she died. If she stopped moving, she died. She turned her back on the cabin and walked toward the lower valley. It was a treacherous stretch of land, heavily forested, shadowed by the towering ridge and prone to extreme temperature drops. But Cora knew this land better than anyone. She knew its secrets. 2 miles from the homestead, hidden behind a dense thicket of black spruce, lay a geological anomaly. Old Man Henry had told her about when she was a child. It was a steep south-facing embankment of solid clay and shale, tucked beneath a massive overhang of ancient limestone. More importantly, Cora remembered Henry mentioning that the snow always melted there a few weeks earlier than the rest of the valley in the spring. When she arrived, the sky was the color of bruised iron. The temperature was hovering at a bitter 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Cora dropped her bag and began to dig. She had no shovel, only a heavy piece of flat shale she broke from the cliff face, and her bare hands wrapped in thick leather gloves. She dove furiously into the side of the embankment, aiming right beneath the limestone overhang. She wasn't building a lean-to. A lean-to would become a frozen tomb. She was building a dugout, relying on her principles she had read about in old survival journals: thermal mass and the Earth's constant core temperature. For 2 days and 2 nights, Cora barely slept. She operated on a primal rhythm of chopping, digging, and hauling. Her muscles screamed, and her knuckles bled beneath her gloves. But the dugout began to take shape. She excavated a room roughly 8 feet by 6 feet, delving deep into the clay. The earth, usually frozen solid this time of year, was surprisingly yielding. The anomaly Henry spoke of was real: a deep, dormant geothermal vent miles below the surface that kept the surrounding soil just a few degrees above freezing. It wasn't hot, but it was enough to keep the ground workable. But a hole in the ground isn't a home. It's a grave unless you know how to trap the heat. Kerr employed a forgotten indigenous technique combined with modern physics. First, she dug a coal sink, a trench near the entrance, 2 feet deeper than the floor of her sleeping area. Cold air is heavier than warm air, It would pool in the trench, keeping the upper living area warmer. Next came the insulation. She gathered hundreds of dry pine branches, packing them tightly against the earthen walls, creating a barrier of dead airspace. She used her single tarp to line the ceiling, pinning it to the dirt with sharp sticks to prevent condensation from dripping onto her. Then she built the heart of her shelter at the coat-of-fire hole. She dug a small pit for the fire and a secondary tunnel angling down to the outside to feed it oxygen. This meant the fire would burn incredibly hot, produce almost no smoke, and be entirely contained. She hauled river stones dense, dark granite, and stacked them heavily around the fire hole. These stones would act as a thermal battery, absorbing the intense heat of the small fire and radiating it into the tiny room long after the embers died. On the afternoon of the third day, the sky tore open. The blizzard didn't just fall, it attacked. Winds reached 60 miles an hour, whipping the snow into a blinding white wall. The temperature plummeted to 30 below zero. Inside her earthen bunker, Cora lit her first fire. She fed small, dry twigs into the Dakota hole. The flames caught, drawing oxygen fiercely through the side tunnel. The smoke, what little there was, filtered out through a small vent she had poked through the overhanging dirt. Within an hour, the magic of physics took over. The granite rocks began to glow with a dull, comforting warmth. The heavy clay walls, insulated by the pine boughs, reflected the heat inward. The freezing air that seeped under the heavy door, woven tightly from thick spruce branches and insulated with moss, sank harmlessly into the cold trench. Outside, it was a lethal, shrieking hellscape. Inside, Cora took off her heavy jacket. The ambient temperature in the dugout hovered at a steady, unbelievable 65 degrees. The shelter did not freeze. It breathed. It held her like a womb in the earth. Weeks turned into a month. November gave way to a brutally cold December. Cora fell into a routine of survival. She set snares for snowshoe hares, foraging for frozen cranberries, and nutrient-densest pine needles for tea to ward off scurvy. The heavy snowpack that accumulated on the hillside above her only served to add feet of unparalleled natural insulation to her roof. She was invisible, a ghost living comfortably beneath the frost line. Meanwhile, back at the main homestead, the stolen paradise was crumbling. Arthur and Beatrice had the cabin, the generator, and a cellar full of canned goods, but they lacked the one thing required to survive the deep Alaskan winter: competence. Arthur, arrogant and lazy, had misjudged the firewood. He had burned through the dry seasoned birch by Thanksgiving, carelessly keeping the wood stove roaring at a sweltering 80 degrees. When forced to chop fresh, green wood from the surrounding trees, he found it wouldn't burn properly. It smoked, sputtered, and provided a fraction of the heat. In a panic, Arthur turned to the diesel generator to run heavy electric space heaters. But diesel fuel jills and freezes at extreme temperatures if not properly treated. In mid-January, during a historic cold snap where the mercury plummeted to -50, the generator choked, sputtered, and died permanently. The great log cabin, exposed to the howling wind, became a meat locker. Without a roaring fire or electricity, the indoor temperature dropped below freezing in hours. Their water pipes burst, showering the floor in ice. Beatrice, huddled under 4 layers of blankets, wept bitterly as the frost began to creep up the inside of the windows. Desperation makes people do reckless things. In a foolish attempt to thaw the generator's fuel line, Arthur brought a propane blowtorch into the attached wooden shed. He was careless. The frozen, brittle wood of the shed wall caught a spark. In the bone-dry winter air, the fire accelerated with terrifying speed. They managed to put it out, but not before half the shed and a portion of the cabin's roof were destroyed, leaving a gaping, charred hole exposed to the lethal January sky. Now, they weren't just cold, they were dying. It was Sheriff Thomas Miller who finally organized a check-in on the lower valley, mostly out of a guilty conscience. He, along with a heavily frostbitten Arthur who had begged for an escort to find his sister-in-law's frozen corpse to formally claim her remaining bank assets, trekked on snowshoes toward the ridge. Arthur was wrapped in every piece of clothing he owned, trembling violently, his face a map of white, dead skin from the cold. They expected to find a frozen body beneath a flimsy tarp. They expected a tragic, inevitable end to a woman cast out into the wild. Instead, they found a pristine wall of snow, save for a small, perfectly round hole near the top, emitting a faint, rhythmic ripple of heat distortion into the frigid air. Thomas approached cautiously, using his ski pole to brush away a layer of snow from what looked like an alcove. Behind it was a sturdy, woven spruce door. Thomas knocked, the sound dull against the earth. The door pushed outward. Cora stood there. She wasn't skeletal. She wasn't frostbitten. Her face was smudged with soot, but her eyes were bright, clear, and sharp. She wore a thick, beautifully crafted hat made of rabbit fur. Warm air poured out from the dugout behind her, smelling of wood smoke and roasted meat. Arthur collapsed to his knees in the snow, his teeth chattering so violently he could barely speak. He looked at the subterranean sanctuary, feeling the incredible wave of heat washing over his frozen face. Cora, Arthur gasped, tears instantly freezing on his cheeks. The cabin, the roof is gone. Beatrice is at the sheriff's station. Solange is losing toes. We have nothing. Please. The twist of fate was absolute. The man who had stolen her kingdom was now begging for a corner of her dirt floor. Cora looked down at Arthur, then at the sheriff, whose eyes were wide with disbelief at the ingenious, ice-proof bunker she had engineered from nothing but clay, stone, and sheer will. She thought about the night she was locked out, the sound of the deadbolt, the terrifying cold of that first walk into the dark. She held all the power now. She could shut the door. She could let the Alaskan winter finish the job they had started on her. The rules of the bush are simple, Arthur, Cora said, her voice steady and echoing slightly in the crisp air. You earn your warmth. She didn't slam the door. She wasn't a monster, but she didn't invite him into her sanctuary either. Instead, Cora stepped out into the freezing air, walked past the shivering man, and pulled a heavy canvas sack from a snow-covered cache nearby. She dropped it at Arthur's knees. It was filled with dry, seasoned kindling, a spare flint, and her old worn copy of a survival manual. There's a shallow cave system half a mile east. Good thermal cover, Cora told him coldly. Start digging. If you're not dead by tomorrow, I'll show you how to build a fire hole. Cora stepped back into her dugout, pulling the heavy spruce door shut. The Leucothic branch of oak, sliding perfectly into two carved stone grooves, slid into place with a definitive, solid thud. Deep within the earth, enveloped by the steady, radiant heat of the stones, Cora poured herself a cup of hot pine tea. Outside, the wind howled, but inside her fortress, it was nothing more than a whisper. Survival isn't always about who has the most money or the biggest cabin. Sometimes, it's about knowing the earth better than the people who try to steal it from you. If Cora's incredible story of resilience and ingenuity kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Share this story with a fellow survival enthusiast, and subscribe to the channel for more true stories of the wild.